Moses led the people out of Egypt and through the Red Sea and into the wilderness. And then Moses brought the people to Mount Sinai. Almost all the people were to stay at the bottom of the mountain. They weren't to touch the mountain. A few people were allowed a little ways up the mountain. It was only Moses who was allowed to go to the very top of the mountain and there commune with God face to face. On Mount Sinai, God gave Moses two big things. The first is the Ten Commandments. The second was the plans, the instructions for building the tabernacle in the wilderness. The tabernacle was a mobile worship center, but it's not like any mobile worship center that you and I would ever conceive of. If I asked you to build a place for worship, you would probably build a building. You would probably build it with a large room. There would probably be lots of chairs or pews or benches that would all face one direction. The direction that they were all facing, there would probably be a raised platform. And on that platform, there would probably be like a table, an altar. And then there would be a lectern, a podium, a pulpit, a place where scriptures could be read and sermons could be given from. There would also be bathrooms and meeting rooms and education rooms and a hall for gathering in. There would be offices, right? That's what we normally think of as a place for worship to be. But that's not what the tabernacle in the wilderness was. It was not a place for people to go and hear about God. It was not a place for them to go and learn things about God. It was a place where God lived and dwelled with the people. God lived with Israel in that tabernacle in the wilderness. The tabernacle was made of three basic parts. The first was this large courtyard. And in this courtyard was an altar. Now we need to talk about what an altar is, because what you and I think of altar is very different from what an ancient altar or the altar in the ancient Israel was all about. For them, an altar was basically like a big barbecue pit. It was an elevated pit. There were sort of walls. They were made of unhewn rock. And they formed a pit, and in the pit was a fire. And then on top of the altar was a grate, like a grill. And when people brought their sacrifices, either the entire animal that was sacrificed or a portion of the animal was put onto the grill, the grate, on top of the altar. To be clear, that wasn't to cook the meat. It was to turn whatever was placed on the altar completely and totally into smoke. It burned it entirely. What was laid on the altar was given completely to God, and given to God through the fire. Also, in this outer courtyard, there was a basin, a large basin. It would eventually be called the sea, and it was filled with water, and it was for ritual cleansing, but it was also for like actual cleansing, because sacrificing is a bloody and messy thing. And so the priests and people needed to like wash the blood off of themselves. So that's the first part. There's this outer courtyard. Then there's a tent structure, and in the tent structure there were two rooms. There was a larger outer room that was called the holy place, or the outer sanctum. In this room there were three main things. There was a table upon which fresh baked bread was placed every day. It too was an offering to God. And so it was placed on this table, and then later it was taken off and was consumed by the priests. It was now holy bread, and so only holy people were allowed to eat the bread. There was also a large standing candelabra. It had a big tower, and it had a bunch of arms that were coming off of it that held these like little bulbs that would have an oil lamp in them. And then there was an altar of incense. Remember, altars are not tables where things are placed on. They are things which things are burned on. And so on the altar of incense, it was incense that was turned into smoke. And then there's this smaller Holy of Holies, this inner sanctum. It is a cube structure. Its length, height, and width were equidistant. And in this inner sanctum was the presence of God, the actual presence of God. It was technically on top of the Ark of the Covenant, which is the one object that is in the Holy of Holies. And we'll talk about the Ark of the Covenant a bit later in this series. But this Holy of Holies was what the whole tabernacle was all about. It was to house the presence of God right there. The courtyard, all Israelites were able to enter the courtyard. The outer sanctum, only priests were allowed to enter. The inner sanctum, no one was allowed to enter except the high priest, and on one day of the year, on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. This tabernacle is the embodiment of God's desire to be with the people. God wanted to be with them, and so God had this mobile house. Because God wanted to be with people, and people are not perfect, and people are sinful, and people, do things that they shouldn't and don't do the things that they should do, the temple also had to have something to mitigate this sin, this waywardness. And so that's why you have all of the sacrifices going on. It's so that the people's sins can be cleansed, they can be cleansed, and then they can live in close proximity with God. Our faith is about just this. It is about being with God. Our faith is not about learning about God, although we will learn things about God, and we should learn things about God, but it's not just about learning about God. Our faith is about experiencing God, being in union with God, knowing that God wants to be close to us, and then realizing that and wanting to be close to God in return. You might know me, if you do know me, as the rector of St. David's in Wayne, Pennsylvania. And you may have noticed that I am not in Wayne, Pennsylvania. And if you notice that, you are correct. I'm at St. Anthony's Monastery, a Coptic Orthodox monastery in the middle of the Mojave Desert. This is one of my favorite places to come and pray and go on retreat. And I travel across the country, and I do all this not to learn things about God, although I do learn things about God here. I'm with Coptic Orthodox monks, and although we share a devotion to Jesus, the way we do that is, the way we live that out and the way we worship is very different. And so I'm learning from them. I bring books with me, and then they have a nice gift shop here that I purchase books in. And so when I'm not in their chapel praying, I'm usually reading. And so I will come away from this week having learned things, but that's not why I come. I come here, I sort of break the pattern of my life and come to this different place, this holy place, to experience God. A question that you could think about yourself, or if you're with a small group of people that you could talk amongst yourself, is when and how have you experienced God? Now, some of you listening to this will have, like, immediately what to say. because I've heard people that have like incredible stories of encountering God. They heard a voice, they saw something, they felt something incredibly powerful. And to tell those stories and to hear those stories is really special and great and amazing. You might be wondering to yourself, experience God. I've never heard a voice. I've never seen something. I've never been like bowled over by a presence. I don't know what you mean. And sometimes God comes in like the big, sometimes what I call the pyrotechnic. God comes with lots of power and might and knocks us over, like in the Transfiguration, when Jesus takes the disciples up to the mountaintop and they literally fall over backwards, experiencing the glory of God. But most of the time, the way we experience God is in a much simpler and quieter way. There's a time when God brings Elijah up a mountaintop to experience God. And there's an earthquake, but the scriptures say God was not in the earthquake. And there's a great fire, but God was not in the fire. And there's a violent wind, and God was not in the wind. And then there is the sound of sheer silence, or the sound of sheer stillness. And there is where God was for Elijah, not in the super impressive, but in the quietness. Even if you haven't had like a crazy experience of God, God is with you. Just like God wanted to be with the people as they traveled through the wilderness, God wants to be with you, and God is with you. And so part of what we do as Christians is we orient our lives and we open our eyes spiritually and we open our ears spiritually to see God around us in the simpler and quieter ways. One of the tools that has been developed over the centuries is a tool called the Examen. And the Examen is a prayer that's prayed at night. It's prayed at the end of the day. And you ask God to be with you. Your mind yourself that God is right there, and you say, God, be with my prayers. And then you walk moment by moment, meeting by meeting, meal by meal through the day. You woke up, and then what happened? And then what happened? And then what happened? And then you had lunch, and then what happened? And then what happened? And what you're doing as you mentally walk through your day with God is you're looking for two things in an Examen. You're looking for the places where you failed to be the person that God wants you to be, the person that you want to be. And you ask God for forgiveness, and you ask God to help you tomorrow so that you don't make the same mistakes that you did today. But the other thing you're doing in an Examen is you are looking for the moments when God was there. I sometimes will say that it is easier to see God in the rear view mirror. We're so busy, we have busy lives, we're doing lots of stuff. And so it is easy to just go about our day and keep our head down to the grindstone and our head in our phone and doing all, and we miss everything. But when we stop and we intentionally look at the world around us and we look at our day, we might say, there was a moment when God was with me. No pyrotechnics, but there was a peace I experienced there. There was a moment of just incredible beauty. There was a moment of grace when I was with somebody else and they said something to me and I said something to them and we smiled back and forth. Whatever it is. I would, over the next few days, challenge you to, at the end of your day, if you do nothing else, just walk through your day mentally and look for the places where God was with you. Because God is with you. God has been with us since the beginning and since that tabernacle in the wilderness with Moses and God's people.